I have outlived the fire. That is the first truth. Not the cleanest one. Not the noblest one. Just the first. I outlived the fire. The steel. The screaming. The orders. The smoke that turned men into shadows before it turned them into memory. I outlived the war itself, which is more than many better men can say. I outlived my youth, my wife, most of my friends. The country we thought we were defending when we were too young to understand what a country asks of boys when it runs out of patience and sends for them anyway. I even outlived the machine. That great steel animal we trusted. That rolling furnace we called protection because we had to call it something merciful. That cramped, rattling box of heat and noise and false confidence. The thing which carried us through mud and ruin and made us feel, on our better days, almost untouchable. I outlived all of it, but I never stopped hearing them burn. That is the second truth. The worse one. People who have never been inside a tank imagine battle as thunder at a distance. Movement. Impact. Maybe fire seen from outside, in the way cinema likes to show it. Cleanly framed. Purposeful. Almost mythic. They do not know what burning sounds like when it is trapped inside metal. They do not know the sound of gloved hands striking steel from within. The sound of a voice trying not to become panic and failing. The sound of men discovering in seconds that heat can rob language of dignity before it robs the body of life. The sound of a hatch that will not move. The sound of another man shouting your name from behind armor that is already too hot to touch. I have heard all of that. And for most of my life, I heard it at night. Not every night. That would have been too simple, almost generous in its predictability. No. Trauma is a more patient craftsman than that. It lets you think from time to time that maybe age has softened it. Maybe decades have blunted the old iron. Maybe you are simply an old man now, ordinary in your aches, ordinary in your silences, ordinary in the way old men drift off in chairs and wake forgetting what day it is. Then some small thing happens. A garage door slams hard. A metal tray falls in the kitchen. A mechanic's torch flashes too bright. A child bangs on a locked car door while laughing, not knowing the body beside him has just forgotten what year it is. And suddenly the air changes. Not in the room. Inside you. And there it is again. The old sound. The old prison of steel. The old knowledge that a man can be alive just a few feet away from you and still be unreachable forever. That is why I am speaking now. Because I am close enough to death to stop pretending silence was wisdom. Because old age has a way of making hypocrisy too heavy to carry elegantly. Because people have called me many things in my life: veteran, father, husband, decent man, difficult man, quiet man. But no one has ever called me what I actually was for most of those years. A witness. That is what I was. Not a hero. Not a symbol. A witness to men burning inside a machine built to protect them. And because there was one man in particular, one face, one voice, one set of hands striking steel from the inside, who deserves more than the small administrative coffin history makes for the dead. So let me begin before the fire. Before the smell of burnt paint and fuel and flesh learned how to live inside memory. Before steel became coffin. Before guilt made a home under my ribs. Before I learned that some men survive war only by carrying a furnace inside them for the rest of their lives. Let me begin when metal still sounded like safety. I did not grow up around tanks. No boy did, not really. Not in the way men later claim they were born for war. That is one of the oldest lies survivors tell, perhaps because it makes our damage feel fated instead of accidental. I was not born for steel. I was born for weather. Open fields, fence lines, machinery that existed to grow things, not destroy them. My father knew engines, yes, but he knew them in their proper moral condition. A tractor ought to start in the morning. A truck ought to get a man to town and back. A machine existed to help life continue. That is what I learned from him. Usefulness, maintenance, respect for tools, respect for labor, and underneath both, a quiet belief that the world, though often hard, could still be understood if a man paid enough attention to how things worked. My mother believed in order. Kitchen order, laundry order, the order of care, not harshness, not coldness. Just a faith that the world was less frightening when things were where they belonged. I think about that often now, where they belonged. Before the war, everything seemed to belong somewhere. Shoes by the door, tools in the shed, letters in a drawer, Sundays in church, planting in spring, harvest in autumn, men growing older in roughly the same place they were born. Even fear belonged somewhere then. Storms, debt, illness, the ordinary precincts of human worry. War changed the address of fear. I was young when it came for us. Young in the usual stupid ways. Too sure my body was loyal to me. Too sure the future had already agreed to include me in it. Too eager to become larger than my own town could imagine. That part matters. Young men do not only go to war for one reason. People like one reason because it lets them sleep better afterward. Patriotism, duty, country. Yes, those were there. But so were hunger and restlessness and the dangerous appetite to be tested. The suspicion that ordinary life was too small for the self you were still inventing. The seduction of uniform and belonging and scale. I wanted to matter. There. That is one of the least elegant truths and therefore one of the most honest. I wanted to matter. A farm boy can feel invisible in his own life for years. War hands him a uniform and suddenly tells him the world has use for his body. That is a hard invitation for youth to refuse. When I first saw a tank up close, I felt awe before I felt fear. I remember that clearly. The size of it. The blunt force of presence. Steel-plated over purpose. Tracks thick as judgment. A machine that did not suggest speed so much as inevitability. It looked less like transportation than argument. A metal answer to every obstacle in its path. To a young man, that can be intoxicating. Where infantry must trust open ground and chance, the tank appears to promise certainty. Walls around the body. Armor between the self and the world. Firepower enough to make distance obey. It seemed, at first glance, like the opposite of vulnerability. That was the second illusion war corrected for me. The first was that courage could be pure. The second was that steel could keep death outside. Training taught us the machine before it taught us fear. Engines, fuel, maintenance, positioning, communication, procedures. The cramped choreography of men learning to move inside a steel box without becoming each other's accident. A tank crew becomes intimate very quickly. Not in the sentimental way civilians understand intimacy. Not by confession under the stars. By proximity. By smell. By routine. By necessity. You learn how another man breathes when he is tense. How he swears when something jams. How he sounds over the intercom when he is tired. Whether he becomes quieter under pressure or too talkative. How much space his fear takes up. How much your own fear can coexist with it. Inside a tank, there is no personal weather. Everything becomes shared climate. Our crew was small enough to become fate for one another. There was Eddie Nolan, our driver. Shorter than the rest of us, with a face that always looked as if it had something mildly sarcastic to say even when it didn't. He had mechanic's hands and a habit of muttering to the engine as though coaxing an old horse through mud. There was Frank Delaney, loader, broad-shouldered, red-haired, stronger than the rest of us in the sort of practical way that matters more than appearance once shells start landing near steel. He laughed hard, ate fast, and wrote long letters home to a wife who had not yet learned how many futures war is capable of canceling. And there was Tommy Keene. Tommy. You always know, when speaking this long after, which name has been waiting nearest the surface. Tommy was not the loudest man in the crew. That would have been Frank. Not the most technically gifted. That was probably Eddie. Not the most disciplined either, though he did his work well enough. What Tommy had was light. Not optimism exactly. Too intelligent for that. More a kind of stubborn warmth that seemed almost disrespectful to war without ever becoming foolish. He came from Boston, or close enough that he corrected anyone who named the wrong neighborhood with a kind of seriousness men reserve for religion and sports loyalties. Dark hair. Quick grin. Eyes that noticed everything. A younger sister he talked about when tired. A mother he pretended not to worry about. A father he claimed had never once said "I'm proud of you" in a full sentence, but who had, according to Tommy, communicated the whole feeling through one good handshake when he shipped out. He could make even a ration taste temporary. He could turn a complaint into comedy before bitterness settled into it. And inside a tank, inside heat and noise and claustrophobia, that kind of man becomes more than company. He becomes air. We all depended on each other, but Tommy was the one who kept the human part of us from sealing off completely. He had a habit of knocking twice on the hull before climbing in, not for luck exactly, but in acknowledgement, as if the machine were a difficult partner whose cooperation had to be requested without ever quite trusting it. I asked him about it once. He said, "Manners." I said, "To a tank." He shrugged. "Can't hurt." That was Tommy. He didn't believe in romance about war. He didn't trust slogans. But he still practiced small rituals of civility, as if refusing to become entirely mechanical himself. We got close through the ordinary degradation of shared danger. Bad weather. Long waits. Cold food. Mud. Repairs. The persistent metallic smell that never fully washed out of your clothes or your dreams. The private little kingdom of our tank, where four men learned each other's limits the way prisoners learn walls. At night, when we were not moving, and the machine rested like a beast sleeping uneasily among other beasts, Tommy sometimes spoke in the dark in a voice just low enough to keep his fear from becoming public property. "What do you think'll get us?" he asked me once. "Get us how?" In the end. I remember not answering right away. Then I said what young men say when they think naming dread will strengthen it. Nothing. He gave a tired laugh. "That's not confidence. That's bad theology." I asked him what he meant. He said, "Everything gets got by something. I'd just like not to die stupid." That line returned to me often later. Men say strange things before they become prophecy. The first stage of tank warfare is seduction. That may sound obscene to say. It is also true. The machine gives you a feeling infantrymen rarely get and civilians do not understand at all. Power, protection, enclosure, the sense that you are inside force rather than merely exposed to it. You move over ground that would terrify a man on foot. You feel weight beneath you, armor around you. The world narrowed to periscopes, gauges, commands, and whatever the engine allows. It is loud in a tank, but it is a chosen loudness. You belong to it. The engine is your noise. The metal is your skin. The world outside may kill, but it must first come through thickness. For a little while, that feels like safety. Then comes the correction. Claustrophobia first. Heat second. Then the knowledge that a hit on steel is a more intimate thing than a bullet passing through air. When a tank is struck, the whole body knows it. Metal transmits violence differently than open ground does. Shock does not travel past you. It arrives into you. The hull rings. The frame convulses. The noise blooms inside the space like something alive. And because there are so few of you in there, because the air is shared and the walls are inches from your face and the exits finite, fear takes on a special density. You do not merely fear death. You fear being trapped with it. That is what tank war taught me before anything else. The infantry fears open ground. The pilot fears fire and altitude. The sailor fears water and cold and depth. The tanker fears enclosure. We learned that gradually, then all at once. Near misses. Impacts that rattled but did not kill. Mechanical failures at the wrong time. Stories from other crews told too casually because no one wanted to hear them with the emotional weight they deserved. Stories of hatches jammed. Fuel igniting. Ammunition cooking off. Men trying to get out through spaces suddenly too small. Hands burned trying to move what had moved freely in training. At first those stories sounded exceptional. Later they sounded possible. Later still they sounded probable. War does that to the imagination. It makes the worst version of an event feel less like nightmare and more like pending paperwork. Still we went on. What else were we meant to do? That is something people ask too rarely when they speak of courage. What else were we meant to do? Men in war do not always advance because they are fearless. Often they advance because routine has already cornered them. Orders, loyalty, position, the knowledge that others are moving too. The shame of being the only body pulling backward when the structure of everybody else's survival assumes your forward motion. We fought. We moved. We endured. And inside the machine, the four of us became less like separate men and more like functions of a single organism. Eddie with the engine. Frank with the load. Tommy with the gun. Me with command. That last word is too grand for what it felt like. Command. As if authority means control. Inside a tank, command often means choosing which fear to prioritize while pretending the choice is tactical rather than mortal. I gave orders. Yes. But I also listened, to the engine, to the terrain, to the crew, to the breathing in the headset, to the little changes in voice that meant somebody was closer to panic than he wanted known. Tommy, for all his humor, understood fear well. That made him good in combat. The worst men in war are not the frightened. They are the men who refuse to know they are frightened and therefore become careless with other people's lives. Tommy knew exactly what terror was worth. He let it sharpen him without letting it own his hands. That is rarer than medals. He once told me, during a lull after an ugly day, steel only feels safe until it starts trapping heat. I looked at him. He shrugged. Been thinking. That's your first mistake. He smiled faintly. You ever notice how every machine has a personality? Eddie snorted over from the driver's position. That's because people break them. Tommy said, no. I mean, they all fail in their own style. I should have forgotten that line. I did not. Because later, after the fire, I thought often about the style in which machines fail and the style in which men do. The machine fails with heat. The men fail with sound. There is always one day in memory that becomes larger than the others. Not always because it was objectively the worst. Sometimes because it wounded the structure of meaning more deeply than the rest. A man can survive terror. He can survive pain. He can survive seeing others die. But if a day rearranges how he understands protection, friendship, responsibility, and his own role inside them, that day goes on living long after the body exits it. For me, that day began in mud. It nearly always begins in mud. Cold enough to keep hands stiff. Ground heavy under the tracks. Visibility bad in the way weather and smoke conspire to make identical. The sort of day where engines sound louder because the sky seems to press everything down toward Earth. We had been moving with other armor, stopping and starting, watching ground swallow the impatient. War in tanks is often less about charge than about timing, angle, terrain, and a humiliating fact that even powerful machines can be slowed to fear by mud, ditch, slope, and visibility. The mood that morning was not unusual. Tired, alert, a little foul-tempered. Tommy had said something before we rolled out about wanting a week of silence and real coffee when the war ended. Frank said, "You don't even like silence." Tommy replied, "Exactly. That's how tired I am." That was one of the last ordinary things he ever said. We moved, listened, adjusted. Inside the tank, time behaves strangely. Minutes can feel too short to think and too long to endure. Your world becomes the compartment, the voice in the headset, the instruments, the vibrations through steel, whatever you can see through limited angles, and the permanent awareness that everything outside is larger than what you are allowed to know. You learn to trust fragments. A report, a flash, a shape at distance, the note in another man's voice. That day, the note changed first. Not dramatically. A tightening in the radio. A quickening in command traffic. The subtle acceleration of men who are trying to remain professional while the situation edges toward bad. Then impact elsewhere. Movement. Reaction. Fire returned. Position changed. War does not always announce escalation in a cinematic burst. Sometimes it simply becomes faster than your moral life can keep pace with. The first hit we took that day was not fatal. A hard strike. Steel ringing through the hull. The whole machine shuddering. All of us instantly becoming more animal. "Still moving," Eddie barked. "Still loading," Frank answered. Tommy didn't say anything at first. That was unlike him. I remember noticing. I gave an order. He answered. Voice steady enough. We kept going. There is a dangerous relief in surviving a first bad hit. The mind, desperate for pattern, begins constructing immunity too early. Not immunity exactly. A temporary superstition of continuation. We're still here. We're still moving. The machine held. We're all right. War hates that thought. It punishes it out of men as soon as it can. The second hit came not long after. Different sound. Different force. A worse one. To this day, I cannot tell you whether the fatal damage was entirely that strike or whether multiple things aligned in one monstrous instant. Fuel, ammunition, angle, bad luck, design, God's absence. What I can tell you is how it felt. The hull buckled inward with sound, so close it ceased to resemble sound and became event. The air changed. Heat arrived too quickly. Smoke where there should not have been smoke. A violence inside the space, not merely outside it. Eddie shouted. Frank shouted too. Tommy. Tommy cursed once, sharply, then yelled that there was fire. This is where memory becomes tyrannically detailed. Not the grand tactical situation. Not the movements beyond us. Those have blurred, as large things often do. What remains is the small room of steel and the exact order in which panic entered it. Smoke first, then heat. Then the impossible acceleration with which every thought narrowed to one command. Out. Out. Out now. Training tells you there are procedures for this. And there are. Of course there are. War always has procedures for catastrophe. That is how it reassures itself before manufacturing more. But procedures do not account for all the ways steel can distort under stress. All the ways men can become briefly larger than openings meant to save them. All the ways fire, once inside a machine, changes from hazard to jurisdiction. We moved. Or tried to. In later years, I have replayed those seconds in useless slow motion, as if any man who examines disaster carefully enough can eventually discover the precise hinge where fate might have become technique. There was shouting, heat intensifying, smoke thickening so fast it felt personal, the sense that the air itself had turned traitor. I got to an exit. So did Eddie, or partly. Frank was behind us. Tommy was trapped. That is the cleanest version. The truer version is uglier. He was not instantly trapped. He was delayed, jammed, turned, caught by the bad combination of position, gear, damage, and seconds going missing exactly where men most need them. You never hear a trapped man think he is trapped all at once. First comes irritation, the belief that force will fix it. Then harder effort. Then the note in the voice changes. That note. God. If I live another 10 years, I will still hear that note. Wait, he shouted. Not a scream. Not yet. Just command turned sideways by urgency. Wait. Then louder. I'm caught. Eddie and I got partly out. Or half out. Or far enough that the world outside and the world inside became two separate moral universes. I could see smoke venting. Could feel heat on my face already. Could hear Frank behind somewhere in the struggle, cursing, shoving, trying. Then Tommy called my name. That part remains polished in memory, as if all the other decades have done nothing but protect that single sound from decay. He called my name the way men do when friendship is no longer social, but biological. I turned back. Of course I turned back. Anyone who asks whether I turned back has not understood anything. I turned back. The compartment was hell not metaphorically but physically. Heat had become shape. Smoke had become wall. Frank was trying to pull something clear, gear, obstruction, body, all of it in one nightmare knot. Tommy was visible in fragments. Face, shoulder, hands. His gloves were on the hatch rim. He was pulling and twisting and cursing and trying not to become what he was becoming. Move. I shouted, as if the will to move had ever failed him. We pulled. or tried. Steel burns differently than flame in the imagination. It does not leap romantically. It transfers. It punishes contact. It informs the hand, instantly and decisively, that the machine has changed ownership. My gloves took the first punishment. Then the heat came through. We fought the hatch, the angle, the obstruction, time. There are moments in disaster when the body knows the race is already being lost before the mind permits the sentence. This was one. Tommy was still alive, still fighting, still talking. That made it worse. Men later speak respectfully of instant death as if quick endings are gifts. Maybe sometimes they are. What I remember is duration. The fact that there was time enough for effort. Time enough for hope to keep reappearing long after it should have been evicted. Time enough for me to believe, in 3 or 4 different seconds, that one more pull would do it. Then the fire deepened. Not larger in movie terms. Closer. A tank on fire is not one fire. It is systems failing into each other. Fuel, heat, ammunition risk, paint, oil. Air turned murderous. Eddie was shouting that we had to move. Frank was half inside, half out, trying to reach Tommy from another angle. The world outside the tank was still war, but all war had shrunk now to one point. Could we get him out before the machine decided for us? Tommy's voice changed before his body did. There it was. The transition. Pain entering command. The crack in the tone where professionalism gives way to the oldest fear in the species. He shouted again. Not words at first. Then words. My name. Frank's name. Something I could not hear clearly through the roar and the intercom and the furnace building itself around us. We pulled. There are no eloquent verbs for what men do in those seconds. No noble ones. We dragged. Fought. Cursed. Burned our hands. Refused the obvious. Argued with metal. At some point Frank got thrown back by heat or force or simple bodily limit. At some point Eddie began physically trying to pull me farther out because the situation had entered the zone where staying longer would no longer be rescue but multiplication of casualties. I hated him for that in the moment. That should be said plainly too. I hated him for being correct. Inside, Tommy started hitting the steel. That sound has no substitute. No language. No score. No clean analogy. Gloved hands on hot metal from the inside. A trapped man turning the tank into his own signal. It was not steady. Not theatrical. Not rhythmic in any dramatic sense. It was desperate. Impact. Slip. Impact again. A body trying to inform the world that it is still present inside the machinery consuming it. People think screams are the worst thing. They are not. Sometimes the worst thing is effort. The sound of someone still trying. I shouted his name. I know I did. Again and again. The smoke thickened. Flame or heat burst near enough that instinct forced all living bodies backward whether or not the soul agreed. This is the part one have prosecuted myself over for half a century. The backward movement. Did I leap? Was I dragged? Did I stumble away because the body chose life before conscience could object? Did the blast make the decision for me? Memory does not always serve justice. Sometimes it protects function. All I know is that one instant I was still trying to reach him, and the next I was outside enough that the tank, our tank, had become an object in front of me rather than the world around me. That distance destroyed something in me. Because once you are outside the machine, and someone you love is still inside it, the moral geometry becomes unbearable. Only a few feet. Only steel. Only seconds. And yet eternity. Tommy was alive in there. I know that because I heard him. He was alive in there after I was out. That sentence has governed my life. He was alive in there after I was out. The hatch would not free him. The fire would not spare him. The machine would not reopen itself because friendship asked nicely. Frank tried to go back once. I think he did. Or almost did. Memory is smoke around that part. I know I tried to move toward the hull again and was stopped. By Eddie, maybe by heat, maybe by reason, maybe by all three acting in the same ugly alliance. And then came the worst stretch. The stretch where rescue had become impossible, but death had not yet finished its work. That is the stretch I still hear. Tommy shouted, then screamed, then hit steel again, then again. I do not know whether he was calling my name in those final moments, or whether I have inserted that into the sound afterward, because guilt prefers personalized evidence. I know I heard him. I know the steel rang with him still inside it. I know every nerve in my body was split between running toward the fire and recoiling from it. That is the thing I most wish people understood about terror. It is not a simple desire to flee. Sometimes terror is wanting two opposite things with equal violence and knowing whichever one your body chooses will accuse you later. Go in. Get back. Save him. No. Too hot. Too late. Too much ammunition risk. Another second and you die too. Go in. Get back. Save him. No. 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 The body jerks. The mind fractures. Time loses moral shape. Then the striking stopped. Not all at once, maybe. Or maybe all at once. There are endings that memory blurs because the exact contour is too final to hold cleanly. But it stopped. And after it stopped, the fire did not. That is another cruelty. The machine continued burning after the man inside it no longer had power to object. War is full of such indecencies. The event outliving the person. I remember staring. I remember somebody shouting something tactical, practical, necessary. I remember not hearing any of it in the part of my mind that mattered. Because there it was. The proof. Steel had not protected us. It had enclosed us. The machine had not been shield alone. It had been trapped waiting for the wrong angle. And the man who had knocked twice on the hull for manners was now gone inside the thing. That is where the war changed species for me. Up to then, death had still obeyed some external logic in my mind. Shells. Impact. Enemy action. Terrible, yes, but still worldly. After Tommy, death became enclosure. Nearness. The unbearable possibility that you can be close enough to touch and still unable to save. We moved on because wars insist. They are machines themselves. They do not halt in respect for an individual moral catastrophe. But from that day forward, every tank I entered was a funeral rehearsal in my mind. The steel no longer felt like skin. It felt like probability. Every hatch became a question. Every heat spike. Every smell of fuel. Every delay in movement. Every scrape of metal against metal. People speak sometimes of after that. I was never the same. It is a phrase that has suffered from overuse. Still, there are moments when no other sentence will do. After that, I was never the same. I continued functioning. That is the ugly miracle of trauma. It does not always disable. Often it repurposes. I gave orders, moved, fought, stayed alive, learned new rhythms of caution, checked exits with a feverish attention, tracked heat the way prey tracks shadow. And all the while, underneath the competence, something had broken its axle. Not courage. That remained in some damaged form. Trust. Trust in steel. Trust in protection. Trust in the neat division between inside and outside, safe and unsafe, man and machine. Most of all, trust in myself as someone who would go all the way back in. That is the trial I held privately for years. Would I have died trying if the heat had been 1 degree less? If Eddie had not grabbed me? If Frank had not fallen back? If the hatch had given 1 inch sooner? If fear had arrived 1 second later? And the filthiest question of all, did some part of me know before reason formed it, that I might live only by letting the fire keep him? There is no judge more inventive than survivor's guilt. It knows every legal argument. It dismisses all of them. I wrote to Tommy's family after the war. That sentence sounds so clean on paper. I wrote, as if writing were not its own form of lying, however necessary. His mother received a version of the event. A survivable version. A version language could hold without collapsing into obscenity. He was brave. He did his duty. It happened quickly. That last line I hated before the ink dried. It happened quickly. No. Quickly enough for historians, maybe. Not quickly enough for a man inside the fire. Not quickly enough for the ears of the man outside it. Still, what was I meant to do? Write the truth? Your son called my name from inside a steel oven while we failed him by inches? Your son did not vanish instantly, but in stages of heat and sound I still hear when kitchen metal falls? No mother deserves that version from paper. Perhaps no mother deserves either version. History should apologize more often to mothers. When the war ended and I came home, people looked at me as if steel had made me harder. Survivors of armor are imagined that way. Solid. Toughened. Men who had literally lived inside war machinery, and therefore must know themselves in some elemental way. The truth was more embarrassing. I startled at slammed doors. I hated confined heat. I checked exits in restaurants without noticing I had done it. I woke at night with my hands curled as if already burned. And every time someone said, "You're lucky those tanks kept you safe," I felt something poisonous rise in my throat. Safe. The word did not survive the war for me. Not in that form. I married a woman who deserved a simpler man than the one who came back. She was kind. War makes kindness look different when you are damaged. Less like softness. More like the steady refusal to demand explanations before the injured person can even bear the shape of the question. She learned my weather faster than I did. Learned that too much heat in a closed room made me irritable for reasons beyond reason. Learned that garages, workshops, and machine sheds could quiet me or unsettle me depending entirely on smell. Learned that I hated fireworks, not for their sound alone, but for the enclosed way shock returns to the body even in open air. Learned that certain nights I sat too long without speaking because the silence inside me was not empty. It was crowded. We had children. There is no tenderness more frightening after war than holding a child who trusts your hands completely. I loved them. Completely. Quietly, perhaps. Unevenly expressed. But completely. And because I loved them, I became afraid in fresh ways. Stoves. Engines. locked doors, a hand caught in machinery, a boy climbing into a car trunk as a game, anything metal, anything hot, anything enclosed. Trauma does not repeat only its original image. It generalizes. The mind says tank fire. The body says enclosure plus heat plus helplessness equals disaster. There were years I could not step into a closed garage if someone was welding. The bright flash, the sudden heat, the smell of worked metal. Too close. People thought I disliked shops because farm life had cured me of machinery after war. Not true. I still loved engines. That is part of the humiliation. War rarely destroys our loves entirely. It contaminates them. I could admire a machine and still hate what it had taught my nervous system. I drank more than I should have after the war, especially in the early years. Not theatrically. Not enough to become legend or warning. Just enough to lower the volume on memory some nights. Enough to put a little blur between myself and that knocking from inside the steel. It never worked as advertised. Alcohol does not erase sound. It only makes the room less able to defend itself against it. What helped more, if help is the word, was work. Real work. Practical work. Engines that meant harvest again. Bolts, tools, worn gloves, grease. Machines in their proper moral station, serving life. I think part of me was trying to redeem metal. To teach my own hands that not every heated engine became coffin. That machinery could still obey decency. Sometimes it almost worked. Then a latch would jam. Or a tool would clang inside a confined bay. Or the smell of burned oil would rise too fast. And there I'd be again, half in the past, half in the present, belonging fully to neither. That is another thing people misunderstand about trauma. It is not only reliving. Often it is divided residence. Part of the self in the current room. Part of the self in the old event. Both operating badly. Both resenting the other's claim. I never spoke openly about Tommy for many years. Not because I forgot him. That would have been mercy. I did not speak because speech threatened accuracy. And if I spoke inaccurately, I feared I would fail him again. So I said less. Veterans do this. You know that already, perhaps. But you may not know why. Sometimes we are not protecting you from the truth. Sometimes we are protecting the truth from being reduced by our own clumsy mouths. How do you say over dinner to a wife folding napkins, "I can still hear a man hitting steel from the inside"? How do you tell a child who only wanted to know if daddy was scared in the war that fear is not the part that lasted? No. We say little. We become difficult in harmless-looking ways. We go outside when rooms get too hot. We leave films early. We dislike locked doors. We become quiet men and let society congratulate itself for respecting our privacy when what it is really doing is allowing our ghosts good breeding. Decades passed. That sentence always surprises me in such stories, even when I am the one telling it. Decades passed. Children became adults. My wife grew older. My own face changed into my father's in certain mirrors. The war became anniversary, textbook, public ceremony, old footage narrated by younger voices who loved the shape of history more than the smell of it. Tommy remained young. That is one of the brutal mathematics of memory. The dead keep the age at which they left. We do the aging for both sides of the friendship. I became older than his father had been. Then older than I imagined anyone could be when I first shipped out. Then old enough to sit among younger mechanics and realize none of them could look at a tank and hear what I heard. That almost made me lonely enough to speak. Almost. What finally opened me was not wisdom, not courage. A junkyard. That is the least romantic answer, and therefore the correct one. My grandson, good boy, curious hands, too much interest in anything with rust and wheels, wanted help looking for parts for an old truck he was fixing. So I went with him. There were rows of dead machinery out there. Cars, tractors, metal husks surrendering to weather. And off to one side, half forgotten, there was an old armored shell from some later era. Not our exact model. Not the same war. But close enough that the body made no distinction worth respecting. He climbed toward it, excited. Wanted to look inside. I told him no too sharply. He turned, startled. Good children notice when old men's voices change for reasons no younger person has earned. He asked if something was wrong. I stood there looking at that steel carcass and for a moment smelled everything at once. Old oil. Sun on rust. Heat trapped in metal skin. The remembered ghost of smoke that wasn't even there. And I heard myself say, I lost a friend in one of those. Not exactly true. Not exact enough. But closer than anything I had said aloud in years. He did not know what to do with that sentence. How could he? He was young. He knew machines as hobby. History as chapter. Death as something that still belonged mostly to older people and bad luck elsewhere. But the sentence remained in the air. And once a true sentence has entered air after years of captivity, silence begins to feel less like discipline and more like refusal. That night I dreamed of Tommy again. But not the way I usually did. Not fire. Not steel. He was sitting on the hull before dawn, boots muddy, cigarette in hand, saying something about coffee, smiling that sideways smile which always made it seem like he was half inside a joke and waiting to see if you were worth bringing into it. I woke grieving in a cleaner way than usual. Because I understood, at last, what I had done to him in memory. I had let the fire reduce him. I had remembered the death more carefully than the life. The machine had trapped him once. My guilt had trapped him again. That was intolerable. So I bought the recorder. And now I am here. An old man in a quiet room, the radiator ticking in ways I do not like, trying to put metal back into language without letting the language harden into false nobility. Thomas Keene. Tommy. You were here. You knocked twice on the hull for manners. You loved bad coffee and good arguments. You distrusted slogans and trusted people slowly, but for real. You worried about your mother more than you said. You made war more human inside the machine simply by refusing to let the machine have all of us. You wanted not to die stupid. And what happened to you was not stupidity, not weakness, not failure of courage, not punishment for a lack of will. It was war. War plus steel. War plus heat. War plus bad angle, bad luck, bad seconds, and the old human lie that protection and entrapment are always easy to tell apart before impact. I need that said plainly. You did not die because you were less than us. You died because the machine became a furnace faster than friendship could reopen it. And I could not get you out. There. The sentence. I could not get you out. Not because I did not try. I did try. Not because I did not hear you. I heard you. Not because I did not love you enough. Love is not stronger than heat and steel every time, no matter what stories need. I could not get you out. I have lived a long time under the accusation that maybe I stopped trying 1 second too soon. Maybe the body in me chose survival before the man in me consented. Maybe courage has an exact thermal limit, and mine was lower than I had ever imagined. I still do not know. Old age has not solved that for me. It has only widened the context. Here is what I know now that I did not know at 23. Men are not judged fairly inside furnaces. Bodies are not moral philosophers. Instinct is not always betrayal. And surviving the fire you could not enter fully does not prove you loved the trapped less. What it proves is only that you remained to carry the sound. And I have carried it. God help me, I have carried it. Through marriage, through fatherhood, through seasons and elections and funerals and harvests and idle afternoons that had no business containing steel. Through every slammed trunk and locked workshop and overheated summer garage. Through all the years I called myself quiet when the truer word was haunted. If you are listening to this and you have never known a tank from the inside, understand this. Armor is a bargain, not a blessing. Protection and prison are very close relatives in war. And the mind does not always recover cleanly from learning that a machine it trusted could become an oven around a friend. If you are listening to this and you have loved a man who came back from armored war different, be patient with what seems like unreasonable discomfort around heat, metal, noise, and closed spaces. Some men leave the tank physically and never quite leave it in the nervous system. Some men spend the rest of their lives checking exits in rooms no fire has threatened. Some become angry in workshops and cannot tell you why. Some go quiet around welding torches and do not have language ready for the humiliation of that fact. I was one of those men. Useful sometimes. Stubborn often. Loving imperfectly. Present in body more than in speech. A husband, a father, a farmer again, a veteran if you need the category. But beneath all of that, in a chamber I seldom opened willingly, I was still the crew commander outside the burning hull, hearing Tommy knock from within. That is what remained. People want closure from stories like this. Closure is a word invented by people who think time is carpenter enough to finish all damaged things. I do not have closure. I have proportion. I have the late understanding that guilt, while sometimes morally appropriate, can also become vanity if it insists on making another man's whole life orbit only around my failure to save him. Tommy was not merely the man who burned in a tank. He was the man who joked about coffee. The man who knocked twice for manners. The man who noticed fear without humiliating it. The man who kept the human air alive in the machine. The man who deserved age and ordinary complaints, and a body that stiffened from weather instead of flame. That is what I am trying to give him now. Not rescue. That was denied. Not redemption. Too proud a word for any of us. Witness. Maybe that is the last decent labor left to old men. To say the names correctly. To remember the life before the manner of death swallowed it. To resist letting war have full authorship over the people it consumed. So let this stand as witness. Thomas Keane was more than the sound he made against steel. And I am more than the man who could not bear enough heat to drag him free. That second sentence is harder for me. I offer it still uncertainly. But old age has taught me that refusing myself any humanity at all does not restore humanity to the dead. It only spreads the fire forward. I do not want to spread it any farther. I want to end, if I can, with something cleaner than guilt. Not peace. That would be dishonest. But maybe accuracy. Before war, a young man sees a tank and imagines power. During war, He learns it is heat, noise, dependence, fear, and the intimate mathematics of enclosure. After war, if he survives, he spends the rest of his life discovering whether steel has an echo and whether that echo can ever be taught the difference between memory and now. Sometimes it cannot. Sometimes all a man can do is sit in a quiet room at the end of life and speak the name before silence closes properly around him. Thomas Keane. My friend. The fire took you. The war took something in me standing beside it. But neither gets the last word. Not if this reaches air. This is my voice. Late. Uneven. Still marked by heat in places no doctor ever diagnosed. And if tonight, after I turn this machine off, I hear metal in my sleep again, if I wake with my hands curled and my chest full of old smoke, perhaps one thing will be different. Perhaps I will remember not only the burning. Perhaps I will remember the knock before dawn, the joke about coffee, the manners, the man. That is where I would like to leave you. Not in the fire. Still here.